Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, this probably won't be the most inspirational chapel speech or talk that you've ever heard, but hopefully it will be helpful and practical. I've been assigned learning to think professionally in terms of financial matters for ministry. And the only way I thought about dealing with that was to just be real practical and think about 3 or 4 things that I've learned that might help people that are just getting started in ministry as far as the professional part of it is concerned, or the financial part of it is concerned. It would be nice if we could all do like the church in its infancy did in Jerusalem in Acts 4:32, where we sort of eschewed all of this stuff and we just held everything in common. But we need to be careful that we don't use those scriptural examples to sort of indoctrinate people, because one example does not sort of apply to all of us at all times, does it? And certainly as the church began to grow and as it extended out into the Greco-Roman world, they're not holding everything in common. If they were, then Paul wouldn't have had to tell them, hey, I'm collecting these funds for the poor in Jerusalem, and would you set something aside into some kind of common treasury so when I come by I can grab it. And so we have not been given that. And ministry has become complex, and professional expectations have been placed upon us. And so we have to sort of deal with the world and the church in a sense that we've been given. So that's the perspective that I'm going to approach this topic with. Now, you may already be working full-time with a congregation, and or you may be anticipating that kind of work pretty soon. And one of the things that you're going to find out very quickly is that the church, in most instances, your congregation, is going to expect you to act professionally, right? Okay? There could be any number of things that might be in a congregation's mind when they think of professionalism. They might expect you to observe professional boundaries when it comes to interpersonal relationships, okay? You might be expected to demonstrate a commitment to lifelong learning and continuing education. You might be expected to receive feedback and reflect on that in a professional and appropriate manner. You might be expected to demonstrate, and I think you will be expected to do this, demonstrate some moral maturity, that you make good moral decisions in your life. You're going to be expected to listen and communicate empathetically, that you can sort of understand somebody else's perspective and communicate that appropriately. You're probably expected to promote congregational unity. Those things are pretty complex things that you'll sort of grow into. And you'll make mistakes, right? And you'll learn better, and you'll grow, and hopefully you'll be better at year 40 than you are 4 months in. And I expect that you will be. But here's the thing. The congregation will expect you to act professionally. Unfortunately, when you start thinking about financial matters, churches and nonprofits sometimes are they're the last ones to sort of do things right when it comes to financial matters and treating you professionally. Now, I don't want to be overly negative, but that's just sort of the way it is. And so the church will expect you to act professionally. So here's what I'm going to suggest. And that is that you have a plan to encourage the congregation that's going to hire you to treat you professionally. Okay? And I think that's only fair. And I think that will create an environment that will not only bless you, but will bless the congregation as well. So when I think about professional ministry in financial matters, the first thing I think about, and some of these things the congregation really has to help you do, or could help you do. Some of these you can do on your own. But the first thing that I think about is I think about the housing allowance. Now, a lot of this is old hat for many of you, and I apologize, but the housing allowance is probably, for ministers, is probably the most important tax advantage that you have. Now, there have been some court cases and some legal things that are happening to challenge this tax advantage that's available for ministers. So there could be a time in the future that this either gets amended in some way, or it goes away completely. So you just need to sort of be paying attention to that and which direction things are going as far as that's concerned. But right now, as it exists, this is a really big deal, okay? Because what you have the opportunity to do with the housing allowance is you have the opportunity to exclude some, or in some cases all, of your ministerial income for federal income tax purposes. We're not talking about Social Security, we're not talking about self-employment tax, we're not talking about state tax, we're talking about federal income tax. And for your ministerial income and for your ministerial income only. But I want you to think about that. I want to think if you could sort of set aside $20,000 and you don't have to pay income taxes on that. Now that can be a big advantage for you. And so I encourage you to make sure that you designate, or have the congregation help you designate a housing allowance when you begin working full-time for a congregation or a church-related employer. It has to be done in advance, okay? So as soon as you get hired, you need to designate how much of your income you're going to include in this housing allowance. It doesn't really cost the church anything. You're just designating it for income tax purposes. Now, what can you claim, or how high can it go? Well, you have to select the smallest of one of the following three things, okay? The amount that you actually use to provide a home for yourself, okay? So you can't include in your housing allowance more than you actually pay to provide yourself housing, okay? That makes sense. Or the amount you officially designate as the housing allowance. So let's say at the beginning of the year you designate $10,000 for your housing allowance and you actually spend $15,000, you can't claim the $15,000. Now you can change it next year to $15,000 if you anticipate that being a regular sort of pattern for yourself, but you can only claim the $10,000. Or, finally, the fair rental value of the home, okay, that you own in this case, including furnishings plus utilities, okay? So the smaller of the amount of one of those three things is what you can claim, okay? So you can't claim more than the fair rental value plus utilities. You can't claim more than you officially designate, and you can't claim more than you actually spend. You have to pick the smaller of that. Of one of those three. Somebody might ask, well, how do I determine the fair rental value of my house? There are a couple of ways to do that I would suggest. First of all, you can find a local professional, a realtor that deals with rental properties in your area, or somebody that has a significant number of rental properties that you trust, and they can do a workup for you and tell you what the rental value is. So that's one way to do it. Another option is that you take the current value of your home, and you may need some expert help in order to determine that as well. And what's typical for a return on investment in the rental market in your area, and determine it that way. So if you did that, let's say your home's worth $150,000 and you determine that 13% in your area is sort of the typical rate of return that's expected. And so you determine 13% of $150,000, which I think is $19,500, and that can be your housing allowance, okay? Up to that amount. Now, the interesting thing is, some of us are in bivocational ministry, right? So you might have a secular job and you might have a ministry job that has a part-time income. And in that case, you might be able to exclude 100% of your ministry income to go toward the housing allowance in those cases. Now here's a recommendation. Now before I start giving recommendations, let me give you this little caveat here. Number one, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not an expert financial advisor, okay? So let me just go ahead and say at the beginning, any recommendations I offer, they're simply a layman's recommendations, okay? So if you need actual legal help or if you need actual financial help, don't come ask me, okay? Find an expert, all right? But here's what I would do with the housing allowance. I would, if I were, and by the way, if you live in a church-owned house, you can still have a housing allowance, okay? But again, it's what you actually spend to maintain the home, okay? So you can include utilities, you could include any kind of upkeep or maintenance expenses that you take on yourself, those kind of things. But the real advantage is when you own your own home or you have a mortgage. I would never, here's the recommendation, I would never pay off my house. If I have ministry income and I have a designated housing allowance, I would never pay off my house before I have a significant emergency fund, before I have significant retirement savings, and before I've saved for my kids' college education. And the reason is if you pay off your house, you're losing this tax advantage, okay? And it's pretty significant, okay? And so I would put those things before. Some people like rush and they want to pay off their house, right? And they want to burn that mortgage, okay? I wouldn't do that unless I have a big emergency fund, unless I've thrown everything I possibly can into retirement, and before my kids are completely taken care of as far as their college education. If you've done all those things, then start paying off your mortgage. Most of us, in reality, we're probably not going to even get close to doing all of those three things, okay? And so the idea that a minister might have a mortgage for 30 years or even longer, it's not actually a bad idea in this scenario. And the second thing I would do is I would stretch myself. If you think, okay, I can afford $800 a month toward a house, okay? And let's say, but the bank probably would lend me enough for a $1,000 payment, and I probably could make that. I can maybe live in a little bit bigger house or a little bit newer house or nicer house if I do that. It'll be a stretch, but I think I can do that. I'd do that. I'd recommend you do that. Because you're going to benefit from the appreciation that the house will provide. It will give you a larger tax advantage. And stretch yourself, okay, a little bit if you're in that scenario. So, number one, housing allowance. Number two, retirement. Now, if you work for a church or a nonprofit, there are basically two really good options for retirement savings, okay? One is, everybody's heard of a 401k, right? Okay. A 401k is for the private profit sector, okay? So if you go work for a firm or something, they may have a 401k that they allow you to contribute to. They may even contribute to it for you, and those are pretty cool situations. In the nonprofit sector, the same sort of thing is called a 403b, okay? And then the other option is an IRA, and there are two kinds of those. There's a traditional IRA, and there's what's called a Roth IRA. I would recommend not worrying about the traditional IRA, okay? Traditional IRA gives you some tax advantages at the beginning because you're able to deduct contributions you make from your taxes right now. But when you withdraw it later, when you're 65 and you start withdrawing those funds, to provide you income in retirement, you pay taxes on them, the growth and the contributions at that point. With a Roth IRA, you don't get the tax advantage right off the bat. You don't get to deduct it from your taxes immediately, but the growth is tax deferred, and if you wait until you're 59 and a half or older and start withdrawing that money, then, and providing you retirement income, that growth is tax-free. Now, question, do you think taxes are going to probably be higher in 40 years than they are now or lower? going to guess? I'd guess they're probably going to be higher. And so a smart person would pay the lower tax now and take advantage of the tax-free growth later where taxes might be higher. So you can do a Roth instead of a traditional IRA. Now, let's talk about those two things, 403B and a Roth. Now, with a Roth, you have a max contribution limit this year of $6,000, okay? So you can contribute $6,000 into a Roth IRA, and it starts growing, hopefully, and over time, that growth is going to continue and compound, and then you can withdraw it later tax-free. For a 403B, you or your employer can contribute up to $19,000 this year, okay? Now, what are the advantages of a Roth? As I mentioned, tax-deferred growth, tax-free withdrawals after 59 and a half. And another advantage is that you if you establish your own Roth, you get to pick what financial institution you use. You may like one particular one and you don't want to be hemmed into something that's sort of created for you. You can even invest, if you want to, in individual stocks through a Roth IRA. With a 403B, sometimes a lot of those things are just sort of chosen for you, and you have limited options within what's been created. But the advantage to a 403B is you obviously have much higher contribution limits. So you go up to $19,000 instead of $6,000. And your employer can contribute directly to that 403B, which is pretty cool, okay, if you can convince them to do that. Now, ideally, what you would do is you would max out your Roth, okay, contribute $6,000 a year to your Roth, and then you convince the church to establish a 403B and contribute to that for you as well. And that would be an ideal scenario. So keep that in mind. And by the way, real quick, sometimes churches and nonprofits are less likely to want to increase your salary, okay? But they might be willing to help you with benefits, okay? Whether that be retirement or health insurance or educational assistance, and we'll get to a couple of those in just a minute. And so you actually might be able to increase your compensation by encouraging churches to help you with retirement, to help you with health insurance, to help you with furthering your education. And so keep that in mind as well. And sometimes the advantage for you coming into churches, if you come into a nonprofit or a for-profit company and they have a long history, they're going to tell you, okay, we're going to hire you at this salary and these are the benefits we provide. You're probably not going to be able to negotiate those benefits. Those are established and that's what everybody gets. If you come into a church and you're the only full-time employee, you might have some wiggle room to negotiate these sort of things. So they may offer you $45,000 in salary, but they might be willing to pitch in $5,000 a year in retirement. Okay, and so you have to ask. They're not going to offer it probably. You need to ask. Okay, and you can probably, I think you can present a pretty good plan that makes sense to churches for a lot of these things. The third thing is health insurance. And there are several options that you can think about when it comes to health insurance. But let me say right off the bat, you can't afford not to have health insurance, okay? In the world that we live in today. I was in a bad car accident in 2009. I was hit by a drunk driver. And so I'm minding my own business, coming home from church on a Wednesday night. I didn't expect to spend a week in the hospital in Huntsville. I didn't expect to have 2 surgeries that week, 2 more later on because of complications. And my insurance, health insurance, my car insurance, the little bit of car insurance the guy that hit me had, all of that went in to sort of provide the coverage that I needed, so it didn't cost me anything. But I saw the bills, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, okay? So let's say you have an accident and you're hurt and it's your fault. And you don't have health insurance. You're going to have to cover that yourself. Most people can't take that kind of hit. You have to have health insurance, okay? And so let's just go ahead and assume that you're going to get it. Now, there are two or three options we need to think about. First, you can have traditional group health insurance that sort of we've all been accustomed to here in this country. And if you go to work for a larger congregation that has several full-time employees, they may be able to offer you that. You may have a spouse that has a job where that's offered. And so sometimes those are going to provide you the best rates, the best options. And so look into traditional group health insurance. With the passage of the Affordable Care Act, you have access to a healthcare marketplace that you can find at www.healthcare.gov. And the nice thing about the Affordable Care Act is basically if you come into a situation, you have a pre-existing condition, you don't have access to a traditional group health insurance plan, you might be in a tough spot before the ACA was passed. But now, of course that's subject to change, but now those pre-existing conditions are sort of, you're protected and you're covered. There's an open enrollment period for the healthcare marketplace. That typically starts November 1st and ends December 15th. Now, you can bypass that if you have a major life change. So if you get married, you can enroll at a different time. If you lose health insurance at one job and you need it through the health exchange, you can get it at a different time as well. But you need to be thinking about that open enrollment period, 1st of November through the middle of December. And there are two other options that I want to think with you about, and that is that you can get a health savings account coupled with a high deductible health plan. A high deductible health plan is basically, it's going to cover major stuff, like the car accident I was telling you about. Stuff where you would have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of health care bills, okay? This is not going to the doctor because you have a little sniffle, okay? And usually those have, as the name implies, really high deductibles, okay? So you only use them in extreme cases and in emergencies. But if you couple that with a health savings account, you can contribute, or your employer can contribute, pre-tax dollars, so that saves you some taxes as well, that can go into a fund, and then you can use that fund to pay for deductibles, co-payments, stuff that your big insurance plan doesn't cover. And so that's an interesting option. And then some people have used successfully what are called medical sharing plans. And a lot of times these are religious-based or church-based plans where basically you create a co-op, everybody goes in together, you pay a certain amount each month, and what everybody in the plan agrees to do is to cover everybody's expenses, everybody's health care. And I've heard a lot of good things from some of these sort of plans. They can be significantly cheaper as far as the monthly expense. It's not dependent on your employment, so you can keep it when you move from place to place. But you're limited sometimes in the networks and the providers that you can use, and pre-existing conditions could be an issue there from time to time, so keep that in mind. And then finally, the fourth thing I want you to think about is educational assistance. As I mentioned, the church is going to be thinking, hey, this person needs to conduct himself or herself professionally. And that might include a commitment to lifelong learning and improving yourself, getting a degree that might help you improve your skills. And so it would be right, if the church expects it, I think it would be right for the church to sort of help and contribute to that. And there are really one of two ways to do this, to make sure, what you want to make sure is anything the church provides you in this area needs to be tax-free, okay? And there are two ways to make sure that these funds would be tax-free. First, you can create what's called a qualified business expense account. Okay, so basically the church, you and the church would get together, the elders would get together, or the church leadership would get together, and you would determine the church would like to make available to you $5,000 a year toward continuing ed. That might be attending a conference, That might be taking a class at a local college. That might be enrolling in a full-fledged degree program, but they're going to give you $5,000 a year. And what you would do is, as you incur those expenses, you would file an expense report, turn that into the church, and the church would reimburse you. In that kind of scenario, you can include tuition, you can include books, you can include fees, you can include supplies, you can even include certain travel expenses, and so that's pretty handy. Now, where it's qualified is that it needs to either help you maintain or improve your skills in a required or in a current role. Okay, so let's say you're in ministry and you suddenly decide, I want to get my MBA. Okay, you're not going to be able to use the expenses for your MBA to go toward this because it doesn't help you in your current role. Okay, churches aren't requiring preachers to have MBAs. Okay, so keep that in mind. So it would have to be a ministry-related course or seminar, and or that it's required by your employer to keep the employee's current salary or status or job. Okay, so it either has to help you maintain your skills or improve your skills in that current job, or if the church says, hey, you're going to have to get this degree, or we're going to cut your salary, or we're going to fire you, that would be included there. And the second way you can do this is the church can establish an educational assistance program that wouldn't just go to you, but could go to any employee of the church. And in that case, you could include tuition, books, fees, equipment. The only caveat is that you can't include, in this scenario, you can't include supplies that you could retain and continue to use after the educational experience is over. So let's say a computer, for instance, you might be able to include that in the equipment part of the degree. But if it's supplies that you buy in order to I don't know, like notebooks, I don't know, paper, I don't know, things like that you might be able to continue to use. Books, are included, but there are some things that you might not be able to include there, but that wouldn't be significant. And the maximum limit for these kind of programs that the church can provide to a particular individual is $5,250 currently. Okay? So that would be the limit that they would be able to provide. And they can't provide travel expenses through this kind of program. And it would have to be offered to any employee of the church. Okay, so they can't say, well, we're going to provide this to the pulpit minister, but we're not going to provide this to the youth minister. Okay, so if the church establishes this kind of program, it would have to be available to any employee of the church to be able to apply and get these funds. Okay, all right. So I know that was really super exciting, and I'm past time. But maybe that's something that, some things that I've said that you haven't thought about yet, and it might help you. But it's been my experience, if you have a plan and you can communicate that plan in a professional manner, a lot of times churches want to help, they just haven't thought it through yet. And if you communicate with them professionally with a well thought out plan, you can probably derive some benefits from that. And I think it would be well worth it because it helps you maintain yourself as a minister, to grow as a minister. It helps you provide for your family, and all those things are going to benefit the church in the long run. Thank you.